Hi, and welcome to Tom Kennedy Science, and I'm your host, Dr. Tom Kennedy. Now today, it's my first part on a series on the cell cycle, and this is for non-majors. So if you're majors, hey, this is a good place to get started, but not going to be quite the detail you might need for a majors course. But hey, for you guys in non-majors, this is a really good introduction where I don't get too technical about what happens in the cell cycle, and I focus more on why it's important to us. Now, I'm also going to talk about cancer in this series, and of course, binary fission. Of course, binary fission happens in prokaryotes, and we'll talk about that first because there's some really cool things that the bacteria and archaeans do that I want to talk about. But let's think about it this way. Why do we care about the cell cycle? Well, think about it this way. Ever since the beginning of life, cells have reproduced. And in fact, reproduction is a key component of living, right? I mean, if life did not reproduce, it would arise as some metabolically active rock. And then whenever those geological processes went away, whatever life was there would perish. So life had to reproduce to ensure the continuity of life. And the first life evolved on this planet nearly 3.8, maybe even 4 billion, with a B, billion years ago, as metabolically active rocks that acquired a membrane and the ability to reproduce and leave their nursery grounds. It's amazing. Now, what's also amazing is that all life has descended from that first population of cells that occurred over 3.8 to 4 billion years ago. I know. So there's been a continuity of life dating back to life's origins. What that means is your great, 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 how many greats? Billions of greats. Ancestors, grandparents, were bacteria living in an ancient ocean over 3.8 billion years ago. Because you represent an unbroken lineage of life going back to the very first cells. And of course, I love this illustration of what the Archean looked like when the Earth was quite young. Now, the first cells were prokaryotes. Life started simply because it had to, right? I mean, you can't just start out all of a sudden super complex. And in fact, it may have taken a long time for life to evolve the complexity or for the geological processes to evolve the properties where life emerged from it. So life started simply, basically because it had to, but it's been going ever since. Now, you're reproducing, life evolves, right? So when a couple prokaryotes merged together through endosymbiosis, we led to the origins of eukaryotic cells. Now it's like the largest restructuring of cells in like 1 billion years, 2 billion years actually. And then of course eukaryotic cells went on to evolve into multicellular organisms, the plants, the animals, and the fungus. And this is where we start to see the importance of the cell cycle. Because if you're a multicellular organism, well, you have to be able to regulate when do your cells grow, when do they divide, when do they die, right? Yeah, cells in a multicellular organism have to be able to have a kill switch in them. So if they become infected or part of the normal growth and development, they can be killed or activate this self-destruct. So the cell cycle is very important for understanding that. Now, I want to talk very briefly in this introduction about cell theory. Now, cell theory is really simple. It basically says the cell is the basic unit of life. So the smallest living thing on our planet is a cell. And all life is made of cells. Even you. You're made up of like 17 trillion cells. And the second part of this theory, in today's world at least, is that all cells come from pre-existing cells. Hence reproduction, right? Part of the cell cycle of growth and reproduction. So whether you're a plant cell, a prokaryotic cell, an animal cell, all cells come from pre-existing cells, at least today. Because of course, the first life on the planet got started by a process called abiogenesis. That's a fancy way of saying life from something non-living. I think my daughter's having a good time in the background. Now, prokaryotic cells, these are our bacteria and archaeans, the simple cells. They reproduce asexually, that means without sex, by binary fission. Now, eukaryotic cells, which make up all plants and animals, they of course reproduce asexually by mitosis and sexually by meiosis. Now, of course, meiosis, that is a way of reproducing sexually. Now, asexual reproduction means without sex. So what is sexual reproduction? Now, sexual reproduction is how most animals, plants, and eukaryotic cells in general reproduce that are not part of a multicellular organism. Sexual reproduction is I take two genomes and I combine them to form a unique organism. So you take the gametes, sperm and egg, and you fuse them together and you create a new organism from that. And each gamete donates at least half the number of chromosomes. So in a human, your sperm and egg have 23 chromosomes each. They fuse to form a zygote, which is a fertilized egg, and that has 46 chromosomes. And then that egg reproduces by mitosis. Now, meiosis is a way of taking a cell that has 46 chromosomes in humans and making cells that have 23 chromosomes. So life goes on, right? Reproducing asexually and sexually. And like I said, there's a continuity of life dating back to the first cells. And this is a reproduction that ensures that continuity of life. And importantly, every time you copy the information to make an organism, it's not always copied correctly. That creates variation in a population. So if you got blue eyes or blonde hair, you got mutations. Hey, if you can drink milk, you're a mutant. You'll learn that in another one on genetics. But basically, those small mutations allow for life to change over time. Now, let's get back into the eukaryotic cells, like in us. Our cells in our body reproduce asexually by mitosis. So basically, they're just making genetic clones of themselves. So your somatic cells have 46 chromosomes. When they divide into two, those daughter cells are going to have the exact same genes and 46 chromosomes. Now, the way that a cell grows and divides is called the cell cycle. Now, inside of an animal, that cell cycle is really controlled. And if you notice on this graph, there's an S, a G1, a G2, and an M. These are the different parts of the cell cycle that include growth, DNA replication, growth and preparing for division, and then M phase, which of course is the mitotic phase. Now, by learning how this cell cycle works, we could treat diseases like cancer. We could maybe slow down the aging process. We might be able to repair our tissues, grow new limbs and organs. So understanding the cell cycle has profound implications for improving our health. Think about it this way. Every one of us started out as a single-celled zygote, right? I mean, sperm and the egg meet, and immediately within a few hours of that fusion, that cell begins to divide by mitosis. And eventually, you grow into an adult. I know, that was me a few years ago. Oh my gosh, do I have to admit it was like 13 years ago? I know. Aging, right? That's why I'm so curious about studying the cell cycle so that, we can slow down this thing called aging. I'm working on it. I'm eating healthy and exercising. But if you think about that, I am an adult. I guess I adulted. I guess I'm an adult. Hard to admit sometimes. But I have about 17 trillion cells in me. And those cells reproduce by mitosis, and they're all controlled by the cell cycle. All the 200 different types of cells in my body that make up all the tissues and organs and organ systems. It's quite fascinating stuff, and I hope you learn to appreciate this a little bit. And something else that we often don't think about with the cell cycle is that, did you know that like every day, not every week or every month, but every day, you lose about 50 billion cells. So as we think of the cell cycle as this continuous process of growth and division, a lot of cells exit the cell cycle. They don't grow and divide. And a lot of cells are told, hey, you gotta end it, man. You gotta get out of here. And they are programmed to die. It's called apoptosis or apoptosis, depending on how you want to pronounce that. So we lose 50 billion every day. And that's to actually make way for newer, younger cells that are growing and dividing. So if you think about it, once again, we have 200 cells in our body. 200 different types of cells. Now, they're all genetic clones of each other, but they're growing and dividing, or at least they grew and divided by mitosis. And then some cells, like I said, they'll exit the cell cycle. Other cells will remain in the cell cycle, and then some cells will commit suicide. And then importantly, our somatic cells, even though we have 200 different types of somatic cells, because they're reproducing asexually, they're all clones of each other. So a skin cell and a liver cell, they got the same genes. They're just expressing different sets of genes of those 20,000 genes that we have. That's pretty cool. Okay, I hope I've piqued some of your interest. So stay tuned for our next episode where I'm going to talk about binary fission.